All right, so now we're going to get into fluid and electrolyte balance. We're going to talk about body fluids and kind of how we maintain the body fluid composition, how do we make sure that it stays balanced, what do electrolytes do, and then talk about where we can find these electrolytes and what do they do in those spaces. We're also going to talk about some of the buffer systems in place and how we can use ventilation to help with this balance, but we're also going to get a little bit into how the kidneys help with this as well, and then talk about some of the problems like acidosis and alkalosis. So if we're looking at body fluid, body fluids make up most of our body. We're looking at about 60% of the body mass, with water being most of that. So about over half of your body weight is going to be from water. And there's two places where we can find these body fluids: the intracellular space, in the intracellular fluids, which is basically your cytosol. This is the fluid we find inside of a cell. And extracellular fluid, which is found outside of the cell, and we can break that down into interstitial fluid and blood plasma, most of which being interstitial fluid. And we need to maintain these body fluids. We need them to not fluctuate very much so that our nervous system, muscles, organs, right, everything at the cellular level can function properly. We're constantly making exchanges of water and solutes through bulk transport, through diffusion, through transcytosis, right, so that we can keep things in balance. It's super important that we control this through ionic compounds as well, like what we call electrolytes, so that we can maintain fluid balance. Basically, like we're using these electrolytes to make water, to make fluids move or stay in a certain way. So things like salts we can use to retain water. And so the balance is determined by the intake and the output of water. So fluid intake, this is what we bring in. We bring this in through ingestion, so like from the food and drink that we consume. Metabolic synthesis, so consider the dehydration synthesis reaction that removes water and creates water, I should say, from linking monomers together, so we can gain water there. We can also lose water through urination, perspiration, exhalation, and defecation. Urination, that one goes without saying because there's water in urine. It's the main component. Perspiration, your sweat contains water. There is a small amount of water vapor in your exhalation, so when you breathe out. And then also there's a bit of water in fecal matter, right? Because otherwise you'd be like super constipated. Now we need to maintain this, right? We need to make sure that we are not gaining or losing too much water. Too much water, right? That actually leads to water intoxication because we can dilute things out. We also don't want to lose too much water because then things get concentrated down too much and we get dehydrated. So overhydration, this can result in increased blood pressure. And so in response to that, we will use atrial natriuretic peptide or atrial natriuretic hormone. This is released by the heart, and this is to help us basically get rid of excess water by getting rid of excess salt. And then in dehydration, we have too many solutes in the blood. This is going to make us feel thirsty. So we have osmoreceptors that detect that the solute concentration has gone up. And so your hypothalamus will make you feel thirsty. We also release ADH or antidiuretic hormone to reabsorb water in the kidneys so we can concentrate the urine down by removing water from it and keeping it in the body instead. So we have urine output that gets more concentrated, which means there's less urine overall being produced. And then low blood pressure, this is something that can result from dehydration as well because there's just less blood volume overall, and this is where we get into our RAS pathway or our RA pathway where we have our renin, angiotensin, and aldosterone pathway in the kidneys. Renin is going to be released by the kidney to stimulate the production of angiotensin, which then will also release aldosterone in response, and this is going to help us with retaining water. It's going to help us retain salt, and in turn, that salt is going to help us retain water. So water, even though we are trying to retain it and try to keep it a right amount, it's always moving between different body fluid compartments. We need these fluids to stay relatively constant in terms of their concentration, at least in the space they're in, so that things don't change. So like in the extracellular fluid, we need it to be isotonic so that there is no water loss or gain by the cells in the body. We don't want osmosis to cause the cells to shrink or swell. But we do have some changes in the osmolarity in the ECF relative to the ICF that can cause them to swell. Again, can be because we've overconsumed water or we've consumed water faster than our body can handle. And so the sodium in our body becomes too dilute and we get water intoxication. This causes cells to swell, and then the large scale effects are things like mental confusion, seizures, coma. It can even kill somebody. This is why there was a huge uproar and I think even a lawsuit with a water drinking contest that was held by a radio station, because I don't think anyone there realized that drinking too much water is actually very dangerous. And if my memory serves me right, there was a woman who participated who actually drank so much water she passed away from it. So it is a big deal. It is a big, big deal. Now, these electrolytes are going to help us maintain fluid balance. So we can use ions like sodium and whatnot to help maintain fluid balance. We dissolve these electrolytes in water, right? So we can have them in the different fluid compartments. We can use them to maintain acid-base balance. We can use them to carry electrical current because ions are charged, and so they can serve as part of an electrochemical gradient. And in turn, that means they can maintain the charge distribution across the cell membrane as well. Now, what the concentration of electrolytes are and protein ions are depends on which fluid we're looking at. So there's different concentrations in the blood, there's different concentration in the interstitial fluid, and there's a different concentration in the intracellular fluid as well. Like the blood plasma has a lot of protein ions like albumin and whatnot. Interstitial fluid, not so much, right? So we do see different concentrations of different things. That being said, the interstitial fluid and the plasma are generally pretty similar except for that. So if we go ahead and take a look at what we see and where, so if we're looking at this picture, we're looking at sodium, we're looking at potassium, calcium, magnesium, chloride, bicarbonate, phosphate, sulfate, and then proteins. And so if we look in red, we have the blood plasma, blue is interstitial fluid, and then yellow is intracellular fluid. And so we see that the blood plasma and interstitial fluid are really similar with the sodium, but then the intracellular fluid for potassium is high. We don't really see that in the blood plasma or interstitial. We see it's relatively low across the board. For calcium, magnesium, we see most of that being inside the cells. Chloride is definitely outside of the cells, both in blood and interstitial fluid. It's more constant, probably the closest one besides calcium for bicarbonate between the three. Phosphate is definitely inside the cells mostly, same with sulfate, and then the protein anions we see mainly inside the cells as well as in the blood plasma, but interstitial doesn't really have any. So let's look at a few of these. We're going to look at some critical extracellular fluid electrolytes. So sodium is one of the big ones. This is used for action potentials. It's used in muscle contraction. It's used to help maintain fluid balance because we use sodium to retain water, and so we can either keep sodium to pull water in, or we can let sodium go to also let water out. So the kidneys and a lot of the hormones involved with that, like ADH, aldosterone, renin, ANP, right? All these guys are going to help control the sodium levels. The anion that's important here is chloride. This is going to help maintain osmotic pressure. We can control this using aldosterone because it can increase the plasma levels by recruiting the sodium back in the blood, which means water comes with it. And then bicarbonate, this is going to help serve as a buffer. It's a major buffer, especially in the blood plasma. And we have kidneys that our kidneys can then resorb or secrete this to kind of help finalize the acid-base balance. In the intercellular fluid, right? In the intracellular fluid, we have potassium. This is the one that's most abundant. We're going to use this to maintain the volume of fluid inside the cells. We also see this in action potentials. Remember, sodium, potassium, and muscle contraction as well. We can use this to regulate pH. And then the plasma levels regulated by aldosterone. Magnesium is another important one that can help with the metabolism of carbohydrates and proteins. It's also going to be helpful in making sure that cardiac muscle is functioning properly and things are transmitting in the central nervous system. Things that regulate magnesium, hypo or hypercalcemia, which is calcium, acidosis and alkalosis. So these are going to help, or these are things that can change, right, how much magnesium we have present in the plasma. And then phosphate, this is used as a buffer inside the cell. It's regulated by PTH, as well as calcitriol as well. Now, who's at risk of an electrolyte imbalance? Really anybody is at risk. However, we're going to talk about some of the key things that put people at a higher risk than normal. And that's going to be those who are dependent on others for fluid and food. So if you cannot feed yourself, that can be because you're very young. This can be because you're very old. It can be because of some sort of disease or injury that doesn't allow a person to feed themselves or give themselves liquids. Or they have to get some sort of assistance with that. People who have to have like chronic medical treatments that involve fluids like IVs, catheters, drainage, suction. People who are receiving diuretics, and anyone who's in post-op. People who have experienced severe burns are at an increased risk. Anyone with a chronic disease or condition, and then anyone who's in an altered state of consciousness, because they won't be able to self-correct, right? So, and you can probably see how there's some categories that you definitely don't fall into, maybe because of age, or you don't have a certain condition of any sort like that, or injury, but it doesn't take much, right? So it's something to kind of keep in mind. So for this one, we're just going to really focus on sodium here and whether or not you have too much or not enough. So hyponatremia is the condition that we call it when you don't have enough sodium. And things that can cause you to not have enough sodium are things like vomiting or diarrhea. If you have a deficiency with aldosterone, if you're taking certain medications like diuretics, or if you are overly consuming water. If you have this, you can experience muscle weakness, headache, dizziness, hypotension, tachycardia, shock, confusion, stupor, and coma. And then if you're on the opposite side, you have hypernatremia, which is too much sodium. This is usually going hand in hand with dehydration, water deprivation. It can also be because you're consuming too much sodium in your diet, or you have the wrong IV fluids being given to you, which causes like too much sodium being added to the extracellular fluid. And this causes basically dehydration on a cellular level. This is going to cause an intense feeling of thirst. It can also increase your blood pressure. It can cause edema, agitation, and convulsions. Potassium is another one that needs to stay this is another really big one. And this is where we get into hypo and hyperkalemia. So hypokalemia, this can be caused because of vomiting or diarrhea, right? Because you're not holding things down or things are passing through too fast. You don't have enough potassium in your diet. You have too much aldosterone produced. You have kidney disease, or some certain diuretics can cause this. And this will cause things like muscle fatigue, paralysis, confusion, increased urine output. Your breath will be shallow. This can also cause changes in your electrocardiogram. And then hyperkalemia, there's too much potassium, right? So you're taking too much potassium in through food, or your kidneys have failed, aldosterone deficiency, certain injuries, especially crushing injuries to tissues, or you've experienced a transfusion where the blood was hemolyzed. This can then cause you to be nauseous, vomit, diarrhea, muscular weakness, irritability, and then it can cause one of the worst things on an EKG that you can see, and that's ventricular fibrillation, which can be deadly. Here's just a couple more. Again, I'm not going to put a big focus on these ones, so you can pause here to read through these, but just look through what hypo and hyper for each of these are like. And then getting to our buffer system, right? A buffer is going to be something that helps resist a pH change, right? That's what it's going to be. It's some sort of chemical that helps resist changes to pH. And so most of the time when we're looking at the buffer systems in the body, we're looking at a weak acid and then a salt of that acid, which functions like a weak base. And so then these are together going to kind of help us avoid changes, like big changes in pH. And these are happening like really quick. Like we're constantly using buffers like in fractions of a second. And so we have the protein buffer system. This is where we're using like albumin. This is the most abundant buffer that we find. So in the plasma, we see albumin. Hemoglobin is going to be the one used in the red blood cells. When it comes to blood pH, we have the carbonic acid bicarbonate buffer system. So this is where I said bicarbonate comes into play big time. And then the phosphate buffer system, this is going to help with pH inside red blood cells and also inside the kidneys as well. And so we're going to go ahead and take a peek at one of these. So here we're looking at with hemoglobin and whatnot. So here we see our protein buffer system. So when the pH goes up, the carboxylate group of an amino acid actually dissociates, right, which is going to release a hydrogen ion, and that allows us to acidify it. So like if the pH is getting too basic, we can pop one of these hydrogen ions off, and that will allow the pH to go back down. So we can kind of see how we can function as how hemoglobin can function. So here's oxyhemoglobin with free-floating hydrogen ions, right? We can then bind that hydrogen to the hemoglobin when we release the oxygen. And we can go back and forth between these two depending on what we need. The carbonic acid bicarbonate buffer system is also super important with maintaining blood pH. And this is again using the bicarbonate ion as the buffer. So when we want to get rid of carbon dioxide, it's going to mix with water in the red blood cells to form carbonic acid. Carbonic acid, as the name implies, is acidic, and so we're getting to that point using the enzyme carbonic anhydrase. However, we can go back and forth between this reaction very easily, and so when we exhale that carbon dioxide out, there's less acid, which causes the pH to go up, whereas if we retain it, more acid, lower pH. But this is basically what's happening is carbon dioxide plus water gets us carbonic acid, right? And then we can further break that down to a hydrogen ion and a bicarbonate ion. And so like if things are too acidic, we can just use especially like the kidneys and whatnot to excrete these hydrogen ions or the bicarbonate ions depending on what we need to do pH wise. The phosphate buffer system is going to act similarly, except we're looking at this inside the intracellular fluid in the red blood cells and inside the kidneys. So here we have dihydrogen phosphate and monohydrogen phosphate, right? These are the ions. Basically hydroxide and dihydrogen phosphate, we have a base and an acid, can bind together to form water, and monohydrogen phosphate, which is a weaker base. Now, how does ventilation come into play with this? Well, the pH is going to, basically we can adjust the respiration, both in terms of depth and rate, depending on the pH. So if we have low carbon dioxide levels, the pH goes up. And so this will tell us we can breathe less, we can decrease ventilation. Whereas if the carbon dioxide levels go up, the pH falls, we get more acidic because we're forming that carbonic acid and then dissociating into hydrogen ions and bicarbonate. This is going to cause an increase in ventilation so that we can get rid of that carbon dioxide. The kidneys are also going to be helping. Honestly, the kidneys do a lot in terms of maintaining the pH. One of the big things they can do that the lungs cannot is excrete those hydrogen ions. I mentioned that a little bit earlier. And so when we look at the proximal convoluted tubule, we have the ability to secrete those hydrogen ions as well as reabsorb the sodium. And then in the collecting ducts, we have proton pumps to secrete more hydrogen ions and then resorb bicarbonate. And so this way we can get rid of the bicarbonate, we can keep the bicarbonate, we can get rid of the hydrogen ions, And this is going to allow us to maintain blood pH in a very narrow range. This is especially important when we are using things like fermentation, or if we're using fats as our fuel source, because those are going to create a more acidic environment. They're going to have more hydrogen ions when we use lactic acid, fatty acids, and ketones. So kidneys, they're going to excrete those hydrogen ions into the urine. And we can have them in the collecting duct. We have the monohydrogen phosphate and the ammonia that are used to buffer this so that the urine isn't too acidic. And then they all get excreted out. So basically like the ammonia and the hydrogen ion will bind together to form ammonium. And then we have our hydrogen phosphate there as well to be excreted out. So again, this helps us get rid of those excess hydrogen ions when our pH is too low. So I know I mentioned it earlier that the lungs can help with this a bit, but the kidneys are really where it's at when it comes to acid-base balance. Now, what happens when things go wrong? Because of course, we got to talk about that. So the normal range for blood pH is like really narrow. It's a 7.35 to a 7.45 pH. And so if we escape that range, we can experience either acidosis or alkalosis, depending on if we've gone too low or high. If we go too low, it's acidosis. This is going to depress the central nervous system. Alkalosis, this is going to cause overexcitability. So we have kind of some opposites there. Now in the acidosis, besides the central nervous system stuff, we're also going to have shortness of breath, arrhythmia, an increased heart rate, seizures, weakness, nausea, vomiting, diarrhea. On the alkalosis side, we have confusion, we have hand tremors, we have numbness or tingling in the hands, feet, or face. We have muscle twitching and spasms, and then of course nausea and vomiting as well. So there's some overlap with the symptoms of both of these. Now, respiratory acidosis, this is where we are retaining carbon dioxide. So we're not able to get carbon dioxide out when we breathe. And so this is because either ventilation is affected or gas exchange in the alveoli is affected because we have some sort of disease like COPD. Metabolic acidosis, this is when we don't have enough of the bicarbonate ions, and this can be caused by vomiting, diarrhea, lactic acid buildup. It can be caused by certain poisonings like antifreeze or renal damage. So if you take too much Advil, that can also cause it. On the alkalosis side, respiratory alkalosis, this is where we're excessively losing carbon dioxide because when we hyperventilate. Things that can cause that are things like anxiety, pregnancy, hyperventilation, anything that causes hyperventilation. So like a panic attack could potentially cause this because someone is maybe hyperventilating as part of that panic attack. And then metabolic alkalosis, this is where we have too much bicarbonate. The causes for this is things like vomiting, diuretics, and also alkali ingestion. So basically if someone overuses antacids, this can cause this as well. So you shouldn't be this is what, and you notice where we talked about antacids, which is over the counter, Advil, which is over the counter. This is why it's so important to follow those directions on those bottles, to not overuse them, because even though they're over the counter, they most definitely can cause problems if you misuse them. Right, and so this is just what we're looking at, the pH versus the partial pressure of carbon dioxide versus the bicarbonate level. Concentration. This is kind of giving you a summary of what we just talked about. So you can pause here if you want to take a look. If not, I'm going to move on in just a second. So how can we compensate? How can we try to correct a deviation? So the lungs and the kidneys will do what they can to try to compensate if possible. Respiratory compensation will allow for a rapid pH change, basically by changing the respiration rate. So in metabolic acidosis, because we have more of those hydrogen ions, we're going to increase ventilation to decrease the partial pressure of carbon dioxide. In metabolic alkalosis, we have reduced hydrogen ion levels, which is going to decrease ventilation to cause the partial pressure of carbon dioxide to increase. On the renal side, this is a slower thing. So respiration compensation is really fast, even though it's not extreme. Renal is going to be slower, but a bigger change, right? It's going to be a more extreme compensation. So in respiratory acidosis, the kidneys are going to get rid of hydrogen ions, reabsorb bicarbonate. And then in a respiratory alkalosis, we're going to get rid of the bicarbonate and keep the hydrogen ions. And so what do we do to figure this out? How do we diagnose an acid-base imbalance? Really, it comes down to a couple things. We have to know where the pH is. Are we on the high end? Are we on the low end? We're going to look at the partial pressure of carbon dioxide, right, to see if it's respiratory, or we're going to look at bicarbonate to say, hey, this is metabolic. We are going to then specify the problem source as respiratory and metabolic, and then we're going to look at the non-causative value and determine if it is compensating for the problem. There's also differences between adults and infants with this, so things that will influence, like when we're looking at the fluid distribution, when we're looking at regulation, and then just overall homeostasis, some things that will influence fluid distribution, metabolic rate, the development of the kidneys, body surface area, breathing rate, and ion concentrations. And so this means that people who are really old or the really, really young, like babies, are more prone to these deviations. It's easier for them to kind of fall out of whack when it comes to acid-base imbalances and fluid balances.